Welcome to the second hour of Jay's analysis, and as you see there on the screen, the Frankfurt School at War, the Marxists who explained the Nazis to Washington. And I cite this because it is foreign affairs, it is a big league globalist publication, mainstream, and even though the article is a subscription-based article, we can't read everything. You get the essence of it in the beginning when we read about Wild Bill Donovan, the guy who started the OSS with the aid of British intelligence, Ian Fleming and William Stevenson, and other characters like that. And who did they want to bring over to help change America, to combat the evil Nazis? Well, they brought over the German Jewish Marxists, the Frankfurt School. Now, I've said this many times, we've talked about it many times, and when you read deeper into this story, you realize, well, it wasn't just Bill Donovan, the CIA, it was also the Rockefellers and the Macy Foundation and Bertrand Russell, all involved in using these degenerates to try to alter Western culture to fight the Nazis. And this is the point that we learned from Quigley, that you can get more done in terms of social engineering in wartime than you can in a few years of war than you can in decades of peacetime, quote unquote. So the wars were really about the altering of not just the global geopolitical sphere, but also the culture back at home, domestic policy. And so hardly anybody actually goes through books from Frankfurt School theorists. But I'm putting this up here to stress to you that it's the CIA that's behind the Frankfurt School guys. Okay? It's not evil commies. Now, they're evil commies, but they're evil commies working for the CIA. This is the point that no boomer will ever get. They will never grasp this. No matter how many books, how many articles, doesn't matter. You can't convince them of this. And let's look also at this. How many times have I shown this? And I can't believe it's now. You used to couldn't access this, but here it is. New York Times, 1973, from a China traveler, and it's David Rockefeller's famous editorial. And he talks about how great Mao is. The social experiment in China is one of the most important and successful in human history. So the CIA, the Rockefellers, love their commies. That's because they also ran the fascists. And Quigley talks about that. So what we're going to do in this talk, and I've done many interviews on Frankfurt School. I studied under Frankfurt School Marxist, and we begin by discussing the distinctions between histmat and diamat, historical materialism and dialectical materialism. Historical materialism aims at achieving an explanation of social evolution that is so comprehensive that it embraces the interrelationships of the theory's own origins and application. This theory specifies the conditions under which reflection on the history of our species by members of the species has become objectively possible. So it's all this Marxist gobbledygook. And he talks about how critique is not science or philosophy. He talks about the importance of empiricism and the rise of the Enlightenment. So for the Frankfurt School guys, they're critical of the Enlightenment. They see the Enlightenment as a kind of mythos, and this is what dialectic of enlightenment is about. Now, they're not totally wrong. They are kind of taking a bit of a postmodern turn here, but their conclusions are false. So we're not going, in other words, so because, for example, on page 5, he critiques technocracy, we're not going to say that he is right because he critiques technocracy. Many people critique technocracy who have completely ridiculous worldviews. So I'm not saying that because a lot of this book will critique technocracy that we need to jump on board with Frankfurt School Marxists. No. But what he does interestingly point out is that science works on presuppositions. So we kind of have a Thomas Kuhn style paradigms approach, and I would agree with that. Now, again, with these people, what you get is, since the Enlightenment is a mythos, since reason is in many ways also a mythos and unclear what exactly reason is and what is, quote, rational, there's a lot of assumptions about that, they're going to argue that it's all mythos. They're going to take a postmodern turn. I don't do that, right? We don't support Foucault, we don't support postmodernism, and we don't support classical liberalism and the Enlightenment. We disagree with both of them because we come from a different perspective that is not modern, and classical liberalism gave rise to postmodernism. So it doesn't. They're both. It's like when you read Thomas Kuhn and Scientific Revolution, Structures of Scientific Revolutions. He's talking about paradigms. He thinks they're incommensurable. You can't choose between one paradigm or another, and that's the stupidity of postmodernism, because it's rejected the actual possibility of objective truth. It doesn't think you can delineate between grand narratives and systems. We do believe you can. So at the meta level, we would reject all of these systems, but we can actually look at the Frankfurt School guys and say, okay, well, they got that point right. Oh, well, but they got this other point wrong. And that's what we're going to do here. So for him, there's a distinction, as we said, between dialectical materialism and historical materialism. And this is the distinction between the Eastern Bloc communists and Stalin, basically. Stalinism versus Trotskyism is what this amounts to. And so the Trotskyite critical tradition continues in the Frankfurt School people, and then Stalinism goes off to be its own thing. So he talks about the methodologies of science, and he talks about different schools that Marxism kind of branched off into, and he talks about how Marxism became obsessed with dialectical logic, dialectics in language, controlling language. Language utilizes transcendental principles. He talks about Husserl. A lot of fascinating stuff in that section, some of which I would agree with. I did a lot of research in terms of Husserl and all that, but we're not going to get too deep into that. He questions the idea of pure knowledge, pure math, pure logic, pure epistemology. None of that, he says, is possible. And that's because there's a real problem with, he's going to try to, again, interject class warfare into the ideas of, well, you want to say that there's reason and objectivity, but really the people who are promoting, quote, reason and objectivity are promoting it because they are organs of the state. So when you go to the university and they talk about rationality and reason, they're just using that as a selling point. They're sales pitch men, car salesmen. Now there's an aspect to which that's kind of true. The university system and the people who operate in the public sphere, many of them, most of them, are car salesmen. But it's a false conclusion. It's a non sequitur to go from that to saying, oh, well, then that means there's no such thing as truth, right? Oh, so everybody is a car salesman, so therefore there's no objective truth. It's just everybody with competing systems, right? But unfortunately, that's where this scheme goes. It goes in that to that extreme. So then he goes into the history of the Enlightenment, page 28, the organization of the Enlightenment thinkers and their approach, and then he moves up into New Earth in it, but he's actually going to go through a kind of a rehearsing, if you will, of Western civilization, and then up to the Frankfurt School guys. So Aristotle is where he starts in the history of Western civilization, page 41, and philosophy with Aristotle. And he talks about Aristotle's politics and historicism. And he talks about Aristotle falling to a kind of historicism. 200 years before its final defeat, he resolutely rejected the classical tradition. He completed the revolution in his approach. He's talking about Hobbes. Hobbes occupied himself with the Commonwealth. He was no longer doing politics in the manner of Aristotle. So he's saying that by the time of modernity with Hobbes, you have the first political definitive rejection of Aristotelian politics. He said this had been initiated in phases and stages by Machiavelli and Thomas More. Really came to fruition with Hobbes. And so you have to understand that for the Frankfurt School guys, they see the political as having maybe not so much a dominance, but a connection to the realms of philosophy and ideals that you can never divide. You can never talk about philosophy and science without also talking about political power structures. Now, they're true. I would agree with that, and that's a critique you will hear me make many times in discussions and interviews. But I'm not going to go where they go with it and say, well, then that means that there's no such thing as real science, there's no such thing as real truth, there's no such thing as real engineering, there's no such thing as real math and logic, because many people utilize these disparate fields to be car salesmen. But for them, the political man is a political animal for these guys, and so they would agree with Aristotle in that regard. But he moves to talk about Giambattista Vico. Vico is an interesting character. I should eventually do some more on Vico. He's kind of overlooked, but he has some really sort of he was ahead of his time when it came to questions of linguistic philosophy and grand narratives and that kind of stuff. But this isn't really the place to launch into Vico. But then he starts to talk about how, well, it's at the same time of, he talks about Aquinas, and he talks about at the same time of the rise of the Enlightenment, you get this idea of natural law. And he does an interesting critique of natural law theory, because, what does natural law actually lead to? And the point is not necessarily a theological point, but he's going to say something like, look, you Enlightenment liberals, you talk about things like natural law. You talk about these principles operating in nature, this kind of stuff. He's going to say, look, I don't think that you can separate these things from the movements of those times and the political figures of those times and the people that were behind these different figures. So, for example, he's going to say, if I were to read one Enlightenment figure who is going to argue for a utopia of some kind, he thinks that's what rationality, quote, reason leads to. He thinks it leads to a kind of collective, either a Hobbesian Leviathan or a Thomas More utopia, or an Adam Weishaupt communist world order. But the other guys across the street who equally deify reason are convinced that reason leads to Jeffersonian ideals of the rights of the individual, freedom, private property, free commerce, free trade, free expression, free speech, etc., etc., etc. Now, which of these is reason? Which of these is reason recognizing natural law? Which of these is the democratic rational process? Now, everybody will have their answers, and they'll shout and scream and try to argue between, Hillary Clinton or Rand Paul. But the question is, again, that's not the point. The point is that I'm saying what Habermas's position is here. Habermas's position is, my point is just that there's no clear way to delineate which of these systems is reason. And then he goes into talking about techne and how the quantification of man and the rise of man as a product, as a kind of unitary device that can be exchanged, just like the Newtonian idea of the exchange of energy. This is what he critiques here, and he says, look, is this rational process too? Is it rational to just kind of see men as interchangeable numerical units, as subjects of techne? Or do we see them as individuals with rights? In other words, are you just a cog in the giant Borg system of Descartes' mechanistic universe? Are you just a cog in this giant wheel? Or are you the pinnacle of human secular dignity and the declaration of human rights out of the French Revolution? Which is it? Are you preeminent as an individual? Or are you preeminent as a cog in a beautifully elegant giant mechanistic system, giant machine? So he says, well, I'm going to go to the beginning of the revolutions. And that's what he does. And so here you have the praise of the revolutionary tradition. And of course, as everybody knows, we start with French Revolution. And he says, what is the French Revolution about? It is about a turn to, quote, natural law. And he says, but guess what? At this time, it was the bourgeoisie against the church and state. So the French Revolution and the revolutions of that time period in 1776, 1789, the 1800s revolutions, those were bourgeois revolutions. Oh, now wait a minute. So who's the true revolutionary? Oh, well, it's the next phase and the next phase and the next phase, you see. Because they might have seen a declaration of the rights of man, quote unquote. But as a critical theory proponent, he's going to critique the critique. This is what you do in Marxism, critical theory. You critique the critique of the critique. You just keep critiquing, because this for them is the whole process, right? Theory and praxis, right? If you're just sitting there and theorizing and not engaging in the action of critique, you're not a good Marxist. But he says, yes, we took a turn away from these spiritual material realities of the medieval world, and we turned to material focus. He says that's true. And he says, then natural law ends up enforced by, quote, reason, which ends up being force. So is natural law Hobbesian Leviathan that enforces the, quote, rational natural law again, or is it the Rousseau will of the masses, or is it the rebel individual? This is a dialectic. Then he goes on to talk about creating law, and guess what? In the American Revolution and the French Revolution, they tried to look back to Plato. They were influenced by Locke, and guess what? This was bourgeoisie guys. This was rich guys, right? Upper class, middle class, noble. Some of them were nobles. I think like Lafayette and people like that were nobles, but many of these guys were either lesser nobility or merchant class. And so then he goes on to talk about how by the time of the young Hegelians, and this is the movement that would influence Marx was, as a student, a young Hegelian, they saw problems in the revolutionary tradition of the classical liberals. So he talks about Thomas Paine, he talks about John Locke, and he talks about Jefferson, and then he talks about Robespierre, and all of these guys. Well, the German idealists, the German absolutists, with Hegel's, absolute spirit, Hegel's idea of the state as the march of God in history, that gets critiqued. That is the basis from which Marx kind of begins, and then Marx turns into the materialist, right? He gets rid of all the spirit crap in Hegel, and he says, look, we don't need any of that idealistic stuff. It's just the here and the now. All right, it's not psyche, it's all just matter. Atomistic matter is all that there is, and that's matter is all that matters, to put it simply. And so then he goes on to talk about we get a critique of the critique, right? So the revolutionary guys of the French Revolution, American Revolution, they were critics of the existing regime. They were the revolutionaries, And again, to be a proper revolutionary, you have to critique the critique. So those guys aren't good enough. They're bourgeois. They're petty merchant bourgeois revolutionaries. And the American Revolution then, for the consistent Marxist, well, it just represents the petty bourgeois, the capitalists of their day. And so the rights of man and the Enlightenment reason mythos is really just the mythos of the Anglo-Saxon merchant class, revolutionary, Masonic people of that day. It doesn't reflect the real principles of, quote, nature. It just reflects that class interests, right? And so hence the attempt to justify this is just a large plagiarism from Locke, right? The founding documents are just plagiarized from Locke. Yeah. Then he goes on to talk about utilitarianism, and then he talks about the stupidity of the idea of the informed citizen, like we're going to have everybody just sitting around and reading the news and studying geopolitics, and at the same time running their farm, and at the same time siring 20 children, and at the same time running all these slaves. And it's kind of funny, actually, the critique of this, the silliness of this ideal that comes out of these revolutionary figures. The public instruction of the nation was the core of the physiocratic theories of Le Mercier, Mirabeau, and Dupont, and each of them drew up a plan for popular education. The physiocrats thought that you could educate the masses through the state, and that this would give you the informed, virtuous citizenry. There is, he says, in all of this, a latent technocracy that will eventually come to the fore. Now, again, you may hate the Frankfurt School. I do. But they were right. They were right that there is a latent technocracy in the revolutionary ethos. And guess what? Aldous Huxley says the same thing. Aldous Huxley says that in Brave New World. He says all the revolutions were leading to Brave New World. Remember? He talks about the absurdity of the idea of being happy, that the natural law principle and life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness just reflects the stupid bourgeois conception of basically wealth and having a farm at the time, maybe some slaves. That's what it is to be happy. And he says, yes, we could trace a pattern from Magna Carta up to Locke, up to the idea of labor in Marx, and then to the idea of the secular state. And he says, yes, it's a turn from the ideas of authority, of objective truth, of a God, to materialism, to flux, to revolution. He says that the positivization of natural law is a matter of revolutions as soon as the rights of man coincide with the principles of society under the common nature of the laws of nature. Natural rights will find their reliable counterpart in the laws of trade and commerce, and then thus the practice of universal free trade will therefore give stronger guarantees of the universal rights of man. They are correct that the universal rights of man is really just a cloak for monetarism and free trade. The universal rights of man was a tool for the merchant class to become mega merchants. It's obvious. And it destroys cultures. Social contract, a bunch of nonsense. There's no basis for it. It's a humorous, satirical sort of theory. He goes into a discussion of Hegel's critiques of the French Revolution, Hegel's philosophy of mind, and because this is very important for dialectics, you see. In Hegelian thought, everything is in the dialectical process. Dialectics is not just an argument tactic. You have to understand this for Hegel. Dialectics is the fundamental truth of reality. Everything is in dialectical process, and it's a triadic process. Triads are everywhere in Hegel, not because he was an Orthodox Christian or a Trinitarian. No, he was a kind of philosophical. He basically threw a couple Christian terms onto a bunch of dialectical philosophy. He's not at all Christian, not in any sense. The German idealism is just another version of Platonism, and it also is influenced by Gnosticism and Kabbalism and Neoplatonism. There is a famous book that I've been meaning to get for a long time about Hegel and Hermeticism, and I keep forgetting to get it. But surprisingly, what I did not expect to see it in this book, Habermas touches on the connections between Hegel and esotericism. And it goes, as I said, back to Gnosticism, to Kabbalism, and to Platonism. So, but once you start to understand that actually these all of these kind of have the same sort of rough skeletal origin, Kabbalism, Platonism, they're pretty much the same as Platonism. Excuse me, Neoplatonism, Kabbalism, Hegelianism. They're really just the kind of structures of Platonism rehashed. So he says, look, what you get in the rise of capitalism is the separation of the state from society. And that's because the state becomes an arbiter in a negative liberty sense to promote the means of commerce and trade. It no longer has the role as it had in the medieval and ancient Christian times, after Byzantine Christianity, the Imperium. It no longer has the role of protecting the church, of promoting virtue, of these kinds of things, punishing vice, defending the ethnos. It becomes an arbiter of commerce, monetarism, and trade. This is the revolutionary bequeathal to the world of the state. The revolutionary period says, we will give you a new state, and it exists to be an arbiter of trade and commerce and money. And hence the idea that it's really just functioning as the legate or the tool of the banksters and the British East India Company and the big corporations. And I would say that's a fair critique. I would say that's probably true. Dialectical materialism, he argues, leads to the Soviet gnosis. Yeah, exactly. And that's what we were saying earlier. Historical materialism is more properly the strict orthodox Marxist perspective. Dialectical diamat or dialectical materialism is what we identify with Stalin and the Soviet regime. All of the major Protestant churches, he says, this is interesting here on page 200. Most of the Protestant churches are Marxist, he says. He says, we have succeeded in bringing the major Protestant denominations into the Marxist fold. Now you say, wait a minute, Jay, earlier you were saying it's not the Marxists, it's the CIA. It's the CIA using the Marxists to convert the churches. And we can prove that what Habermas says is true by looking at the World Council of Churches, the National Council of Churches, the ecumenical movement, right? You'll find a lot of older patriot-style critiques of ecumenism and National Council of Churches, World Council of Churches, UN. Those are all connected groups. And the older critiques will say, The commies are behind the ecumenical movement. The commies. And if you were only looking at the layer of Habermas, that's why you would think that. But what is on your screen right now? What do you see? Frankfurt School brought over by Bill Donovan and CIA and Bertrand Russell and Rockefellers and Macy's. So that's how. CIA, let's just make it easy here. Call it CIA Rockefeller Communists. Call them that. How's that? The CIA Rockefeller Communists, like Habermas, is who is admitting, yes, we Marxistized, we pinkoed, we made red all these dumb Protestant churches. And they all went along with it because they're phony balloonies. Capitalism will lead to socialism. We get kind of a rehash of the older Marxist ideas. He's kind of critiquing Marxism here. And again, if you doubt that, what? Rockefeller's behind the Marxist turn in all the churches? What did I just show you? What did we just look at? From a China Traveler, David Rockefeller, talking about how awesome Mao is. If David Rockefeller loves Mao and the Chinese Revolution, and he loves how Chase Bank was the first bank set up in communist China, don't you think he loves Habermas and the Frankfurt School? Of course he does. Marxism, it does lead to scientism. Marxism is positivistic, just like scientism. But he's still going through the critique of Western thought, and he's talking about Hegel. Hegel has a presuppositional critique of Kant, which actually is true. Kant wasn't very consistent. But this section of the book is actually about theory. So he's saying, he's looking at theory in these different characters. Hegel, Kant, right? And he's saying Marx, and he's saying you can't just have theory. You can't just have German idealism. You got to have theory and praxis. That's what this book is about, is that it's the attempt to have a synthesis between, and this has always been crucial to the Marxists, is that you can't just have theory, because we're not Platonists, we're not monks contemplating, we're not navel gazers. We have theory and praxis. Action, struggle. You must take action. You must be political. You're a political animal. This is the heart of Marxism, to be active. Marxism is perpetual, constant critique. Page 212. If you've heard Jonathan Bowden's talks, he's the only other person who's grasped this that I've heard, and he understood what he was talking about. I'm not saying that everything Bowden says that I agree with. I'm not saying that Bowden is correct in his Nietzschean views, but Bowden is correct in the way he understands these guys. And my professor for these guys, as I've said many, many times, was a Frankfurt School guy. He was not directly in the Frankfurt School. What I'm saying is that he did his dissertation under one of the Frankfurt School guys, and his dissertation was on Hegel and republicanism or something like that. That was my longtime advisor. Anyway, dualism and Gnosticism is discussed here, page 215, and he talks about how Isaac Luria, Kabbalism, influences Hegel. Yeah, right. Kabbalism, Luciferianism leads to Hegelian Gnosticism, and that all gets Marx gets consumed with all that, and then Marx dumps all that for Marxism. The presuppositions of Hegelian logic are in Marxism, is what Lenin said. Yes. I'm not going to read a bunch of Marxist gobbledygook because it's just a waste of time. But really what you get at is process, theology, process, philosophy. God himself is part of the dialectical process in Hegel, page 216. Yes, I talked about that in my lecture that I did on Kant, Hegel, and Aquinas, Western dialectics. And all these Marxist guys are people who are being consistent with the revolutionary dialectical tradition. I am not saying they're correct. They are the end result, the logical conclusion of the dialectics that have been in place since we in the West put dialectics into our view of God. When did we do that? When we introduced filioque, when we introduced relations of oppositions into God to distinguish the persons, Father, Son, and Spirit. The way that Aquinas distinguishes the persons, relations of opposition, is dialectics. And it is not the Eastern view. The Eastern view is hypostatic origin. It's the only way that you distinguish the persons. Two different views of the Trinity. And what we get in the West is what St. Gregory Palamas said. He said, your dialectics, Barleum, will lead to atheism. And here is the conclusion of that. Jurgen Habermas, page 219. Man is God. There you go. Everything I've argued for 10 years and longer proven. That leads to economic man. Homo economicus. Man is essentially seen as an economic unit because his sad, futile attempt at proclaiming himself God reduced himself to nihilism and no meaning. What a shame. I wonder if the Frankfurt School guys didn't know that would have the effect on mankind in the West. Well, actually, we know they did because they say that's what they wanted to do, to destroy the West. So let's be clear to everyone, because we are making a lot of libertarians and classical liberals mad here because they think they're fighting Marxism. And I'm saying, yes, if you want to call it Marxist, okay, but it's CIA, Rockefeller, Marxists. CIA, Rockefeller, Marxists. The CIA, the Rockefeller, Marxists. Best exemplified in Jurgen Habermas. And so the interesting end of the book is not what you would expect. He goes into modern thinkers, Karl Popper, open society. Oh my gosh, get that out of here. Who's worse, Popper and open society democracy, or Frankfurt School? I think I'm going to argue that Habermas's critique would actually probably be better than Karl Popper's open society democracy. Because at least in Habermas's critique, you see how evil and Gnostic and bad all this stuff is. And he points out how stupid and ridiculous the mythos of Karl Popper, and open society democracy is. So I would actually say Theory and Praxis by Habermas would be a better read than Karl Popper. Because the Enlightenment, as he says, is a myth. And Popper perpetuates the stupid myth of the Enlightenment. And then he goes on to correctly say, I will admit this point, I will concede this point to Habermas as well, because we've argued it for a long time too, that the danger of all this revolutionary ethos, impetus, milieu, spirit, zeitgeist, is technocracy. It all ends in the whole logos, the evil logos of this system, of all the revolutionary movements, is technocracy. Guess who else said that? Aldous Huxley, didn't he? Yes, at the beginning of Brave New World. All the revolutions culminate in the technocracy. Now here's another testimony, Jurgen Habermas, telling you the exact same thing. This actually should be in the Globalist book series. We need to put this in the Globalist book series. I will probably do a separate video, just a kind of a brief 10-minute talk on putting this in the Globalist book series, Habermas's Theory and Praxis. But I think that's the essence of this book. We don't have to really dive into all the petty, endless neologisms and obscure arguments. And I mean, they're worse than scholastics. These Frankfurt School people. We're not going to go into all the Marxist specifications and nuances. That's the essence of this book. And again, it's very similar to a dialectic of enlightenment, where we have the critique of the Enlightenment mythos. That's really what the totality of that book is about. But this book is the critique of the critique of the critique. So here Habermas is saying we need to continue the revolutionary tradition, which is a perpetual critique, right? The revolutionary tradition, it was exemplified at one time by 1789. It was exemplified at one time by 1776. It was exemplified in a way into the young Hegelians with Marx. But even those guys need to be critiqued, right? Frankfurt School has no problem critiquing Marx, because that's what you do as a Marxist, is you critique their critique of their critique of their critique ad infinitum. And that's because it is a never-ending dialogical process, just like their metaphysic is, right? Historical materialism. Matter and history is in a never-ending process, philosophy, dialogical exchange of flux, right? Moving to synthesis, moving to convergence. This is the Hegelianism again. What's the convergence? Global government, global state. For the classical Marxist, the utopian state at the end, when the state dies, right? The eventual withering away of the state. And that's what we get here. But we do have some insights, as we said. So critiques of scientism, some good critiques of the revolutionary tradition and mythos as just as much a myth as the... I don't believe Christianity is a myth, but he's saying you Enlightenment people are hypocrites because you call Christianity a myth, and yet you have a complete mythology. Your materialism, your natural rights, Declaration of the Rights of Man, that's another mythology. And from that worldview, from that perspective, yes, it is, right? But again, we're not accepting the idea that all paradigms, all worldviews, all systems are just incommensurable, and they can't be delineated between. They can be, and that's because we have the logos not as an impersonal principle, but as a personal God. So thank you for listening. We will, as I said, this does actually count as one of the Globalist books. So it is a Globalist book. I've been meaning to do it for a long time, because it actually hammers home so many of the points I've been trying to make for a long time. So I hope you've enjoyed that. It is boring. It is dry. Nobody wants to, I guarantee you, nobody wants to read 300 freaking pages of 280, whatever it is, of Jurgen Habermas. I did it for you. You're welcome. Thank you for listening.